I also realize the the extent and variety of farming practices in the Upper Cumberland. And so it's kind of difficult to come up with one talk to focus on uh, the range of equipment that could very well be talking about tonight. And so what you're going to see in this presentation is every color of equipment. Okay, I did it on purpose. I tried to make sure that I didn't focus too much on any one color of equipment. Tried not to focus too much on any one size and age of equipment. If you look at my own personal fleet, my equipment ranges from 1969, a Ford 2000 diesel, which does all our bush hogging, okay, to a nice Kubota, which is my newer model. And as always, when working with the university, we've got to have the disclaimer that just because you see a color, just because you see a brand, it's not a recommendation on our part. It's just a convenience for the educational process.
Dr. Buchanan?
Yes.
Let me interrupt just 1 second. I know you're fixing to really kind of get into the meat of this. I want to remind those that are out there that are listening, there is a feature, and you may or may not be real familiar with Zoom. At the bottom of your screen there on that black bar at the bottom, it says participants and they'll say chat. You'll see a little chat window down there. Guys, if you have a question, ladies, if you have a question, click on that chat. It brings up a chat window and you can type a message there. And at the end of Dr. Buchanan's presentation, we'll address questions and ask those. But as he's going through and you're thinking of stuff, think some questions to ask him, just type it in that chat box there and hit enter, and we can get those, and Dr. Buchanan can see those and address those when he gets finished. So I just wanted to remind him of that, Dr. Buchanan.
Oh, that was outstanding. That's exactly what we want folks to do. Okay. And even stop us and ask questions. So, but the chat does work real well. And believe me, we're not great in spelling. So don't worry about that. If we can figure out the word, we'll go from there. So, in thinking about where have you spent your money for your farmstead, first was the land. Okay. But second's the equipment. Okay. That's your second biggest investment. And any way that we can get any way that we can maximize that return on investment, we've really got to take advantage of. And so to do that, we've got to do maintenance, and we've got to think about how to protect our piece of equipment from the elements. Okay. Now, I have come a long way in my own ability to maintain equipment as compared to what I was trained to with my father. My father would throw a 5-gallon bucket over a lawnmower and call that putting it in the garage. And this didn't work very well. So in thinking about the kinds of things that we can do for a piece of equipment, whether it's a tractor or whether it's a grain elevator or a hay baler, okay, round baler, square baler, the first thing we really need to do is approach the owner's manual and find out what is recommended by the manufacturer. Now, often we trade equipment, and when we trade, we don't always send the owner's manual with that piece of equipment. So like you, I have plenty of stuff that doesn't have an owner's manual. But then we have this wonderful thing called the internet. And it's really surprising the manuals that you can find where somebody else has made a copy of it and put it out there so that we can get a copy of it and find out, some of the tools and techniques and maintenance requirements of our various pieces of equipment. And equally important to that is on the bottom. If you still have a piece of equipment that's under warranty, then your owner's manual is going to help you make sure you don't void your warranty. But as we go through this presentation, and I start with this very chilly picture there, which is a very beautiful picture, we got to think about what the basics are. And we're going to start with the fuel, and then we're going to go to the oil, and then we're going to go to water, the radiator, the battery, the hydraulics. What about those tires? What happens when the temperature drops? My wife and I, we've worked our way up to having a newfangled vehicle that has air pressure sensors on the tires. okay? And sure enough, when we hit a cold spell, we get a low pressure light somewhere on that car, okay? And so we've got to remember that, as the temperature drops, so does the pressure in tires. And we may have to add some more air to it. And as Wayne mentioned, sprayers. Yeah, we've been out there spraying, and we've got some water left in that pump and left in the lines. And we don't do something about it, that water will freeze, expand, and rupture something we don't want ruptured. And what I thought I would add to this was, items that are out there in the environment, and especially if they're cattle handling equipment, they're in a very aggressive environment. If we can find those surfaces that need a little greasing, then we can keep them from rusting and keep that piece of equipment usable for a long time to come. This is one of my favorite maps of the state of Tennessee. It is 1896. And it says on the side, if you look over on the right-hand side, it says a preliminary agricultural map of Tennessee. And this was produced by the Tennessee Agricultural Experiment Station in 1896. For those of you in the Upper Cumberland, you're familiar with the Plateau Experiment Station. And so the same group of folks been doing this work for a long, long time. But the real picture, the real notion of this picture is we're in Tennessee, okay? And we're in the Southeast. And just, how cold of a winter could we really expect to have here? Well, we got to go back and think that, in 1985, we set a record low of -26 Fahrenheit, okay? So we can get that cold. The good news is it doesn't stay that cold that long, but it can get that cold. It's interesting from an engineering perspective that the design frost depth in Tennessee is 18 inches. So anything that we don't want to freeze, we need to put at least 18 inches below the soil surface. And I just cackle at that. Because if we ever froze the soil to 6 or 7 inches in Tennessee, we would be shut down. Okay, that would be a much longer cold spell than anything we'd ever experienced before. So certainly that design depth of 18 inches has plenty of safety factor in it. But we do get cold days, and it just takes one long cold night to freeze water and to rupture some equipment. So as we go through this talk, I'm going to ask this other question. Are you going to store your equipment for the winter? You don't really anticipate using it? Or do you need to use that equipment during the winter? And it really gives us two trains of thought here. Okay. Now, I suspect a good many of you are already feeding your cows. Okay. We've already had a frost, so the grass has quit growing. You're feeding. You're already seeing some mud in the pastures and such. And so we need to keep that equipment going, some of our equipment going all winter long. Well, that's a little bit different thought process for winterization than parking a piece of equipment and letting it sit until spring. We've also got to think about how old your piece of equipment is, okay? On the right there's an old Jubilee, okay, covered in snow. And while I think most of the Jubilees were gasoline tractors, if we have an old diesel, like my 1969, it has a very different fuel system than a brand spanking new diesel that you see on the left-hand side, okay? One of the first things that's changed is the pressure produced by the pump, okay? Now, we've always known that the diesel pump produces a lot of pressure, even in the older engines. Now it's even higher. And that's part of emissions, part of our desire to make them run more efficiently. And so we have smaller injectors which require greater pressure to get that fuel through there, okay? All right, but now we got this ultra low sulfur diesel fuel. Would that make a difference between an old and new piece of equipment? And we're going to talk about that here in a few seconds. So how old is your piece of equipment? Different fuel requirements, different lubricants, okay? So we got to think along those lines. But right here is where we need to focus. You see that oil water separator that he's holding in his hands there is covered in wax. That wax is from the diesel fuel that gelled. Okay. So at about 32 degrees Fahrenheit, number 2 diesel, which is what we burn, will start to get cloudy, not solidify, just start to get cloudy. And what's happening is those paraffin wax particles that typically are dissolved in number 2 diesel start to come together and start to form turbidity in the diesel fuel. As it gets colder from that point, then we get enough of those paraffin wax particles to start clogging things up. And when it clogs up the fuel filter, we're done. Okay, no more. So if we're going to be running that piece of equipment all winter and we want to have some dependability for starting it and running it, we need to look at our diesel fuel. Okay, so historically we want the number 1 diesel fuel. Okay, number 1 fuel, and that has a lower gel point. We have lots of additives out there that we can use, stay with our number 2 diesel and add the additive to it to further reduce the temperature of the gel point. Okay. But the important message for this slide is you can't wait till it gets cold before you add the additives. It's too late then. You've got to get the additive in your fuel and the fuel mixed through your system before it gets cold. Okay, so that's something to take into account. But I've got to admit, it's been a long time since I've worried about waxing up a piece of equipment. Okay, it gets cold here, yes, but then the next day it warms up and the paraffin gel can then thaw out and redissolve into the diesel fuel. Okay, but again, if we want dependability, we need to think about putting the additives into the diesel fuel to prevent the gelling. One major difference between how we winterize a diesel engine and a gasoline engine is we think about keeping the diesel fuel tank full. We think about gasoline, we think about emptying it. Okay, we'll talk about gasoline here more in a moment. But with diesel, with the fluctuating temperatures that we have, if we have a half full tank, then as it warms up and cools off, we get more condensation of the moisture in the air into liquid water into the fuel tank. Okay, and so that's really the bigger problem. So for us on the Upper Cumberland, and I count myself among your number because I've got property in Morgan County, we've got to think more, just about as much about the potential for water condensation in your diesel fuel as an equal problem to the potential gelling. Okay, but here again, there's an additive for that. Okay, so we can add additives that will not homogenize, but I'll think of the right word, emulsify the water with the diesel fuel and allow the water to go on through the system. Okay, and so a lot of our diesel additives can do both, can handle the water and reduce the gel point of the diesel fuel. Now, I think there's an important note next to the bottom of this slide. Number 1 diesel has a different energy content. It actually has less energy in it than number 2. That's why we don't burn it all the time. So that might be a consideration. Now, it's not significant. It is significant, but it's not going to keep your engine from working as hard as you want it to work. So again, if you got diesel storage on farm or the diesel engine itself, you need to have a good fuel filter, which will also pull the water out. Okay. And so all of us have, on our tractors, a filter system. And once in a while, we need to open the bottom of that filter up and let the water drain out. Diesel's going to float on top of the water. The water's going to sink to the bottom. Now, of course, there's two things. We want to make sure we've got the full volume of the fuel filter doing its job. And two, we just don't want the water in there. Okay. We want to let it out because it could freeze, expand. It's not likely to break the filter because it can expand up into the diesel fuel, but we just want to get rid of it. Okay. We don't need it there, and it needs to go away. So again, I've opened it up a little bigger now. It's not just a tractor that has a diesel engine. It's also the storage tank where you have diesel, and water can, condense inside there. And we need to have that separator. And also we need to think about having that diesel tank slightly tilted to the rear. Okay. This has been a recommendation since I was a 4-H'er. I remember seeing a picture in a 4-H book about having your tank slightly tilted to the back so you could drain the water off the bottom. And I'm bringing this picture back out for us to use. So we can have the suction side of that pump slightly above the water and sludge layer, and we can drain the crud, which is a more polite word, out the back of the bottom. You don't want to drain it on the ground. We've got to do it right. We've got to handle it as a environmental hazard and as a flammable hazard. So we've got to think about how we're best going to do that. And so here's this, okay? Here's this, and I'm going to invite you to go down to the bottom of the slide first. Not everybody agrees that this is a problem. And here's the problem. Here's the problem statement. This new low sulfur or ultra low sulfur diesel fuel doesn't have the same lubricity or lubricity, I don't care how you pronounce it, that the old diesel fuel did, okay? And I must admit, I'm kind of in the camp that believes there is an issue, okay? Because it just feels different. When you get that ultra low sulfur diesel fuel in your hand, it just doesn't feel as slick, okay? So I feel like there really is an issue. Now, whether or not it's significant to the injector pump, to the injectors, I don't know, okay? I don't know. I do concern myself a little bit about it. And so right now, the red diesel, which means I'm not paying taxes on it. Well, actually I am. Co-op makes sure that I do. But the red diesel that I've been able to get is still the high sulfur content, but that's not going to last much longer. Okay, even the non-taxed diesel fuel is slowly but surely going to become the ultra low sulfur. And that's been a function of the construction industry. So when you hear somebody talk about off-road vehicles, they're not talking about ATVs and four-wheel drives. When from a machinery standpoint, we talk about off-road vehicles, we're talking about bulldozers, backhoes, trackhoes, and agricultural tractors. Okay. And so the off-road vehicles have come under increased scrutiny for emissions. And so the ultra low sulfur content diesel fuel is going to be, is taken over. Okay. All right. So here's the controversial part. When you look on forums for folks who own older tractors like I do, and they're concerned about the lubrication difference of the new diesel versus the old diesel, you'll see a lot of folks say, I take care of that problem. I just add a little automatic transmission fluid to my diesel fuel. And I go, I don't know. Okay. And here's why I hedge. Okay. A lot of automatic transmission fluid has friction modifiers in it to make the friction plates inside your automatic transmission work better. Well, friction modifiers are not necessarily friendly to lubrication. Okay. So the issue is controversial. Okay. We're not going to solve this problem tonight. It's just something a lot of folks talk about. Okay. And something to think about. But here is our future. If you don't already have one of these, you will. If you have a diesel pickup truck right now that's relatively new, you have this. And the issue is putting the diesel exhaust fluid in there because you have a selective catalytic reduction system, okay, an SCR. Now you're going to see more and more farm tractors. The construction equipment's already there, okay? The days of seeing that bulldozer push a tree over and seeing that black smoke roll out of the stack, history, okay? History. And we're getting there now too. So the selective catalytic reduction systems require this DEF, okay, diesel exhaust fluid, to create a reaction in your exhaust system. So you have a very heated, a very hot catalyst there. Okay. You've heard of catalytic converters. This is very similar. With that, with this diesel exhaust fluid, it's actually injected beyond the cylinders. Okay. So it's in the exhaust system itself. It's injected in there, and the urea that's in it, the nitrogen, reacts with that catalyst, reacts with the nitrous oxides that are coming out of the exhaust, and we end up with nitrogen gas, okay, rather than nitrous oxide. And that's better for us. Truly is better for us. All right, I've said all that just to reinforce the point. This stuff will freeze on you, okay? So if you're carrying a jug of this in the back of your truck, it'll freeze at 12 degrees Fahrenheit. And it'll expand by 7%. If you're keeping it in the original container, you're probably okay. Just let it freeze and it'll expand and then shrink back down when it thaws out. But if you've got it, in a different container, then we got to take into account that it will expand on you. So that's the real point of this slide. Gasoline. All right. You've got lawnmowers, you've got gasoline tractors, you've got gasoline trucks and cars and so on like that, ATVs. If you're going to park it for the winter, drain it, okay? Pull as much of the gasoline out of the tank as you can and keep running it until you've got all the gasoline out of the carburetor too. If you've got a really small engine or older technology, gasoline engines that don't have injectors necessarily, then you've got a fuel bowl on the bottom of your carburetor where the float's at. And if we don't pull even it dry, that varnish is going to set up inside of that bowl, and we get to rebuild that carburetor next spring, and that's annoying. Okay. So if the engine's going to be operated throughout the winter, you're okay, because you're going to be replenishing that gasoline through that engine. So if you keep using it, gasoline engines are really easy to winterize. We just use it and keep putting new gas in. If we're going to use it intermittently, use the stabilizer, okay? In my adult life, I've become a big proponent and user of the gasoline stabilizers, okay? I'm amazed how well they work. I can park my lawn tractor in the fall with gasoline in the tank, with gasoline in the carburetor, and it'll start in the spring as long as I've got that stabilizer in the fuel. So what's the problem? The problem is this: stale gasoline. Everybody smelled stale gasoline. It's bad. It's rust smelling, okay? Gasoline has a limited shelf life. What's going on? It evaporates and leaves behind the heavier compounds. You know, there's no such thing as a compound that is gasoline. It's a mixture. And it's a mixture of volatile compounds and heavier compounds. And the volatile light ones, they evaporate out, leave the heavier ones behind, and you end up with this thing that we call varnish. Okay. It's not really varnish in terms of what we put on a piece of woodwork, but it might as well be. It's a coating. Okay. It coats the system. Okay. And so the rule of thumb is don't buy more gasoline than you'll use in 30 days. But if you add a stabilizer, okay, and I'm getting real, my tongue is very close to saying a brand name, but I won't. If you use a stabilizer, then you've got it for a couple of years, okay, a year maybe. All right, so we really need to think about if we're going to store gasoline. I store gasoline myself because I have a generator. Now, I found that buying that generator was the best homeowner's insurance I could purchase, because since I bought that generator, my electricity has not gone off. But just in case it does, I have a generator and I keep some gas around during the winter for that purpose. All right, so that was a great purchase. I just haven't used it. But here is the big ugly gorilla in the room, ethanol. Okay, this is the big ugly gorilla in the room. Ooh, ethanol absorbs water just by itself. Just by itself. If you had a cup of pure ethanol, it would suck moisture out of the atmosphere. Okay. You mix it with gasoline, and now that mixture draws even more moisture out of the atmosphere. So, you know, ethanol is bad enough as it is because we lose power. Okay. Ethanol gasoline mixture has less horsepower in it than gasoline by itself. That's why you get less miles per gallon. But then you add some water to it and you're really losing power. But then you add the corrosion. Okay. Moisture, metal parts. So we get corrosion of metal parts. Oh, and then there's another one. Ethanol is a great solvent. Now, gasoline is a good solvent. Kerosene is a good solvent. Ethanol is a better one. Okay. So when you have a solvent, you start dissolving things, and dissolving things include rubber hoses and plastic tanks. Okay. So I have a weed eater. I've had it for, I don't know, nearly 20 years now. I've rebuilt it a couple of times, but I was surprised when all of a sudden I had to replace the fuel tank. I didn't drop it. I didn't break the tank. It just got thin on me. Okay. Well, the ethanol mixture, and I made the mistake of using ethanol gasoline mixing with the 2-cycle oil, that led to that damage. Okay. I don't anymore. I've learned my lesson. And speaking of 2-cycle, look there at the bottom. You've got a mixture of gasoline and a 2-cycle engine lubricant, the engine oil. Those mix together really well. They've been designed to mix together. But you add ethanol to that mixture, the engine oil that we mix with a 2-cycle doesn't mix with the ethanol. Okay. So if we've got a 10% blend of ethanol, then 10% of that in burnt gasoline, ethanol, oil mixture doesn't have oil. And so there's a possibility that our little 2-cycle engine is not getting lubricated well enough, okay, to minimize the wear. So therefore, I've got to say it. Go buy 100% gasoline for your small engines, okay? It's more expensive, but it's well worth it. I found this picture on the internet. I've never seen a pump with this many selections on it. I've seen 4, but I've never seen 5. And so you've got ethanol free over there off to the side. So if you can go find 100% gasoline just to keep for your small engines, it's worth it. If you can find it, if nothing else, just for your 2 cycles, it's worth it. Okay. Especially with the 2-cycle engines. But the ethanol is not good for the hoses, for the plastic tanks, and so on like that. And it's slow. It's a slow problem. If you don't maintain your equipment anyway, you probably never know the difference. But if you got a piece of equipment you want to last for 10 or 15 or 20 years, then you're going to have more problems with an ethanol blend in your small equipment. Okay, now let's really get expensive. I use this for my chainsaws. Okay, I don't use it for my weed eater. Now I go buy 100% gasoline and put the 2-cycle oil in with it for my weed eaters. Okay, because the weed eater gets used all summer long. Okay, and then I winterize it and I don't think about it again. My chainsaw gets used, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 times a year. And when I decided I need to use it, dadgummit, I wanted to start. And so this stuff works. I really don't mind putting a recommendation on it. Now, I blanked out the brand name. You'll find plenty of this brands, of these mixtures out there. You just gasp at the price, okay? If you expand it all the way out to a gallon, yeah, it's $20 a gallon. But in my chainsaw, I won't burn a gallon a year, okay? And I want it to start when I'm ready for it to start. So yeah, I really do recommend the pre-mixed premium fuel for your very low use 2-cycle engines, okay? The bottom line that I put down there, 2 of them, was one for a particular brand. I guess I really shouldn't say what the brand is, but for a particular brand, it'll double the life of your warranty if you use that mixture. And 2, it's less expensive than buying a new carburetor, okay? Now, one of the beautiful things about these little 2-cycle engines is you can rebuild them in a couple hours, if not less. And like I said, I've had that same weed eater for 20 years and it's on its 3rd carburetor. Okay. It's just easier to replace the carburetor than it is to rebuild it or to clean it out. Since I started using this, it doesn't need near as much work. Okay. Wow. That was a lot of information just about fuel. Okay. And another thing that I should have said up front, when me use the word fuel, I don't mean just diesel. Okay. If I mean diesel, I'll say diesel. If I mean gasoline, I'll say gasoline. Fuel is the bigger picture. Okay. Now let's move into engine oil. I think everybody knows we have multi-viscosity oils. Okay. And years and years and years and years ago, I would help my father change oil in cars, change oil in trucks, change oil in tractors. And for him, it was straight weight, whatever he found on sale. Okay. Well, it turns out that we got the W wrong. He said straight weight. The W actually means winter. Now, how about that? Okay. So when you look at that multi-viscosity that you see right there, it says SAE 15W40. The 15 is the viscosity that oil is going to have when it's cold, winter, and the 40 is the viscosity it's going to have when the engine warms up. All right, so it's not weight, it's 15 winter grade, and then 40 when it warms up. If you got SAE 30, then that's just straight grade 30, the viscosity that you have when at 30, okay, for warmer temperatures and such. So again, we've got to fall back on what does the manufacturer recommend for our piece of equipment to operate during the winter. We know that oil will thin as it gets warmer. Well, if we don't have something in there to thicken it up as it gets warmer, it'll get too thin. Okay, so we have the 40 weight, the 50 weight. We also know that oil will get, when it gets cold, it just won't move. So we have the lesser viscosity so that we can get that engine lubricated as it warms up. So there are all these different grades of oil out there. And, for the most part, the most common multi-grade oil for farm equipment is 1540. But again, let's check that owner's manual and find out what's recommended for it. The one of the first pictures I had up was talking about, is it an old piece of equipment or a new piece of equipment? The difference can be the size of the journal spacings and the bearing races, the size of the gaps and some of the lubricating surfaces and such. And newer equipment has smaller spaces than the older equipment does. And so we may not need to run, or should not run, the higher viscosities that we might have run with an older piece of equipment now that we have a newer piece of equipment. So that's a real reason to fall back on that owner's manual. Oils, what's a brand name mean? Okay. I remember once upon a time that I only burned Valvoline. I don't know why. It was just a thing. I just burned Valvoline. Okay. Means nothing to me now. We got people that are diehard Quaker State fans. Okay. What really matters, though, above and beyond the brand name, is it labeled by the American Petroleum Institute, an API licensed oil? Okay. And yeah, all the brand names are, but even the off-brand names are. Okay. Would you go buy Walmart brand oil and put in your brand new car? Oh, heck no. Why not? Okay. So we've got to understand, what the certifications are for oil. Now, I've got an interesting comment there on the bottom. You can actually send a sample of your used oil off to a laboratory, and they'll provide information back about how much life is left in it. We've got a lot of people that are going fully synthetic with their engine oils, with the notion that, hey, I'm only going to change my oil once a year. It's doable. Okay. It's real. But if you're going to go with a longer life, it wouldn't hurt to have a little insurance that says, hey, this sample of oil that you send me, it was still in pretty good shape after this many miles or after this length of time. And maybe you can go a longer time. It also looks at the metal content that's in the oil and see if you're getting excessive wear. But getting back to the notion of having it labeled, every licensed can of oil has this donut on there. And we're not going to go through this piece by piece, but I would invite you to do an internet search on these different components. So you see right at the top, there's that 5W30. Okay. Well, then you have lots of other initials that might suggest this oil is more appropriate for diesel fuel. This oil is more appropriate for a gasoline engine. All right. We buy Rotella engine oil for our diesels. Okay. Well, why? Well, it's still oil, but Rotella has more detergents in it that are more appropriate for a diesel engine. It's not a better lubricant. It's got more additives in it that are more appropriate for a diesel and would be overkill for a car. That's the high and the low of it. Okay. And so if you want to know more about your oil, you can start right here by seeing how it's labeled on the side of your can. When it comes to the drivetrain of your equipment, there's really not a whole lot to do except make sure you've got the levels correct. Okay. Transmission, check the fuel level, change the oil, change that fluid as recommended by the manufacturer. Newer tractors have transmission filters, have hydraulic filters that older pieces of equipment didn't have. Okay. And so we may need to evaluate those and change those. Wheel bearings, okay. Does it, what's the recommendation for how often that wheel bearing should be repacked? Do we just, is it good enough just to pump some grease in there and get the lubrication that you need, or do we need to disassemble it and repack it? Okay, so these are legitimate questions, and the winter times are a great time to do that. Especially if you got some heated space where you can tear into this and rebuild it and have it ready for the spring. Okay. But when I started thinking about the grease, and I said, I read somewhere, and I try to hold to it, that greases are not interchangeable. So if I have put a moly or a lithium grease on the bearings of my livestock trailer, then I'm going to, next time I repack them, I'm going to use that same blend, because not all of them are interchangeable. So when you think about what a grease is, other than something's in a very annoying thing called a grease gun, it's a semi-fluid to a solid that's a dispersion of a thickening agent and a lubricant, okay? So when it comes down to it, it's oil, but it's put in some type of thickener, and it has additives in there. So one of the thickeners I put on the screen there for is lithium soap, because you'll see lithium grease. Well, the lithium is one of the thickeners. You'll also see grease that says has moly on the side of it. Well, it's because it has millennium disulfide in there as an additive. So we kind of need to know which one we're using and kind of stick with it, okay? Because sometimes they're incompatible. We've got to, pay attention to the labels and such like that. And remember that the main purpose of a grease, why it is so thick, is to hold that lubricant on those moving surfaces. If we had a choice, if we truly had a choice, we'd bathe that bearing in oil like we do an engine, if we had a choice. But we don't have a choice. And so we use grease as the second level of protection, okay? Now, you see the grease gun there, and pointing at you in the screen is the tip of the grease gun. Did you realize that at the tip of the grease gun, you can twist that nozzle and make it grab better onto the grease zerks? That is a rarely known thing that you can do with a grease gun. All right, so because of different additives and different thickeners, be careful with your high-speed bearings. So I'm talking about your trailers, your equipment trailers, your trucks and such like that. I'm not talking about a 3 mile per hour tractor. That's not a high-speed bearing, okay? But you do need to be consistent with what you use. I've got the picture here of this packer. If you've never used something like this before, and I had not until a couple of years ago, I was amazed about how much better this was to pack a bearing than doing it with my palm, like I was trained to do by my parents, okay? You put your grease in the bottom of this, you place that bearing or that cup, and you squeeze it down in there, and it forces the bearing to go up in between the rollers, just as pretty as you can be, okay? So it's a pretty neat tool. Engine cooling. All right. So my memories of winterizing equipment when I was a kid was the weatherman saying it's going to get below freezing tonight, and my father jumping up from the table and said, "Come on, boy, we got to go drain all the radiators." Okay. Did they have antifreeze in them? Oh no. Okay. They had water in them. And so we'd go out and open that peacock valve on the bottom of it and drain it down. Okay. So if we don't have antifreeze, we can bust an engine block and we're stuck. Okay. It's our fault. We should have done something better. I think all of us now have antifreeze. The purpose of antifreeze, it's listed when you buy that jug, it's listed as antifreeze and coolant. it really does nothing to contribute to cooling. It does not increase the heat transfer capability, but what it does do is provide anti-corrosives for your pump system and other parts of your cooling system. The main purpose of it is to keep the water from freezing, okay? And it does that real well. So you can check your antifreeze. These little testers that you can buy at your auto parts store, they work, okay? They're good enough. If it says you're good down to 30 below zero, you're probably good down to 30 below zero. But you need to test it. You need to know that, okay? And antifreeze wears out. It does not last forever. The antifreeze and the anti-corrosive properties degrade with time, okay? Whether you use that equipment a lot or not, time is the bigger issue. And of course, you've got to be very, very careful with this around pets. It has a sweet taste to it, and they will consume it, and it'll do great harm to them. I mentioned tires a little while ago. A great ballast for your piece of equipment is to put water in the tires. Well, did you mix it with ethanol? Now ethanol is a good thing. Did you mix it with methanol? Did you mix it with calcium chloride? Ooh, that's an old technology, putting salt back there. But it is rough. You know, back in the days when we had tubes, that salt mixture stayed in the tube, wasn't such a bad problem. Now that we have tubeless tires, that salt mixture is not such a great idea. It does put more weight back there than water and ethanol or methanol, but it's not such a great idea in terms of keeping that piece of equipment running for a long term. It will corrode that rim out. Now, when the temperature drops, the air collapses a little bit, we lose pressure, and you can see we've got a flat spot going on there. And we need to make sure we fill that tire up back to recommended pressure, because that puts a lot of strain on the sidewall to drive around with that tire even a little bit low. And we want those tires to last as long as possible. Now, the flip side of that is when it does become spring, we start getting some 70, 80-degree days, the pressure is going to jump up in those tires, and you may have to let a little air out. But speaking of tires, if you're going to use this piece of equipment all winter, and knowing that we typically get as much ice as we do snow, you might consider some chains. Now, that picture right there, that's $1,000 worth of chains. And you go, ugh, okay, ouch. And you ultimately may not really need them, but chains do make a big difference on the operation of a tractor on ice. So if you're like me, I happen to be the neighborhood good guy. I have my little front end loader. I go out and I scrape the road in front of our house and down to the main road just to be a good neighbor. But I've almost slidden off the road a couple of times while doing that. And that would have been, my expense. But while you're thinking about those tires, when was the last time you looked at the pads on the brakes? Okay. Oh, the battery. Okay. That's my battery. That's my old Ford right there. The package says it only weighs 60 or 70 pounds. I swear it weighs 140. When you go to move that battery around, you got a backache, okay? But the reason I bring this up is you lose a bunch of cold cranking amperage when it gets cold, okay? So at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, you lose 65% of the capacity of that battery. So if you've got, a battery or a piece of equipment you want to keep operable during the coldest weather, you may think about trickle charger to keep that battery fully up to snuff. Now, an older tractor like that has voltage leakage. So I might go several months and not need that piece of equipment. And all of a sudden the battery's dead. And you go, what? What caused that? Well, it's just part of an old tractor. It leaks electricity. So one of the things we can do is just unhook the battery, okay? And then it can't leak it anymore. But when we unhook it, it's a great opportunity to check for corrosion. So that in a nutshell was what we need to think about doing for our mobile equipment, for our tractors, maybe on-farm trucks and such that don't get a lot of use. But anything else on the farm that has water associated with it is still going to freeze up. And we got to think along those lines. So we got sprayers and washers and irrigation systems and even livestock waters. Okay. So to me, this is one of the easiest things to overlook. It's sitting out there, you know, we sprayed in the spring and we hadn't thought about it since. We might do some fall spraying and we hadn't thought about it since. We may have used all the chemical out of the tank, but it's still in the valves, it's still in the lines, it's still in that filter down there on the bottom of the pitcher, and it can freeze and rupture something. So it's still very much a part of the water. So one of the things we can do, we can put this RV antifreeze. Why RV antifreeze? Simply says it's non-toxic. Okay. Now that doesn't mean you go mix it with your, your breakfast, but it's relatively speaking non-toxic compared to good old-fashioned antifreeze. And so if you're working with this and the pets are around, then you got a little better chance of not poisoning one of them. So we recommend that you drain the tank, appropriately of the chemicals that you've had in there, blow out the plumbing with compressed air, which a lot of people would stop right there, but go ahead and take the next step. Add this RV mixture to the bottom of the tank and run the system, run the pump, cycle the valves, and spray through the nozzles until you start seeing some pink stuff go through, and then shut it down. Now what's left in all those lines and in the pump has got antifreeze in it, okay? And so the process would be the same whether or not you have a boom sprayer or a boomless sprayer, as you see on the right here, okay? So, we need to protect that as part of our investment that we made in this piece of property. One that's relatively new to me, okay? In the springtime, we pressure wash big chunks of the house and the property and sidewalks and such. And, that might be 1 of 2 times a year that I pull that pressure washer out of the shed. And you know what? It had water in it too. And if it has water in the pump head, like you see in the picture, it can freeze, expand, and do damage. So here's this, additive, not necessarily an additive, but a solution that you can purchase that has a fitting on it that looks just like a garden hose fitting. And you pump it in there. You just squeeze the bottle and get it circulated all through your pump and then leave it in there. And it does 2 really important things. One, it's now got something in there other than water that has a very low freezing point. But for those of us on hard water, and that's all of us on hard water, it keeps those minerals from depositing inside your pump and keeps those internal valves working better. So this is a real cheap piece of insurance. But in thinking about all the things that we have on the farm that need maintenance, now's a great time to do it. Okay, we've got the harvest in. We're feeding cows every once in a while, and we're done bush hogging. And so now's a great time to break some of this equipment down and work on it. So get the owner's manual out. Figure out what it takes to get that belt off of there. What does it take to get that hose off of there? Check those connections, okay, for air filters, and replace the oil filters, and check for corrosion and such, okay? But then there's this. Now this is my picture. This is my tractor, okay? So it starts out the top, it says clean your equipment, okay? The grass and the grain, the hay, whatever biomaterial you're working with, if it's still on that piece of equipment, then that's a great place to make a nest if you're a mouse. Nice and warm and comfortable. It's got some grain in there, so it's good to chew on. And oh, by the way, they'll reach over and grab one of your wires and chew the insulation on it too. So we want to not encourage them to be there. Now, the other thing that happens is if you have mice around your farm equipment, you're going to attract the predators of mice. So right there on top of my gas tank, on top of my tractor is a chicken snake. Okay, I don't know what else to call it, but a chicken snake. But at the moment that I raised that hood and saw him, I became the bigger chicken. Okay, I about had to go change my underwear again. But then once I calmed down, he and I came to a mutual agreement that he really didn't belong there. But the other thing related to varmints is if they build a nest on the engine itself and you don't realize it, and as you run that engine, it gets up to temperature, that's a place that can catch fire. And next thing you know, you've got an engine fire and you have no idea how or why it came about. And the other issue there, right there on the bottom, I'm bad myself about bush hogging and leaving all that detritus sitting on top of the bush hog deck itself. It gets rained on, it holds moisture, and next thing you know, we've rusted it out. Hydraulics. Here's an interesting point there on the bottom. Okay, don't leave a cylinder fully extended for the winter. Now, I must admit, I wouldn't think about this, but somebody else pointed this out to me years ago. And so, yeah, it does make sense. If you've got that hydraulic cylinder fully extended, okay, when it's cold, and then when it warms up, that oil is going to want to expand, and now you got no place for it to expand. Okay, so where's that pressure going to back up to? So if you don't have it extended out all the way, then as the oil expands, the cylinder can continue to go forward. Okay. All right, as we start to wrap this up, the question is, these cattle are hungry. Will your tractor start when it's cold? And that's a really important consideration. Okay, you're out there to make sure they keep gaining weight, and we've got to make sure that tractor starts. It's going to start when we have a good battery, when we have good fuel, when we've changed the air filter, when we've done all the maintenance. But speaking of cattle, okay, gosh, how much money did you spend on this head gate? All right, and other pieces of equipment out there. But you've got that sliding surface there that no longer has paint on it. Let's take a little grease and smear on there. Okay, we'll inhibit the rust and we'll keep it lubricated. Now we want to make sure that what we're putting out there doesn't have any toxicity issue with the cattle, and you can find plenty of products that are just fine for that. But those kinds of surfaces will really appreciate a little lubrication. But as we get into this time of the year, maybe the whole place needs a little maintenance. And this is a very common picture. Okay, we get out there, we drop that round bell, we back out, it's rained all week long, we got a soupy, muddy mess out there. Let's give that some thought. Okay, let's give that some thought. We don't want to get stuck. We don't want any cows breaking legs. So what can we do to minimize that issue? Can we move the location of the feeder throughout the paddock? Could we use the fence line feeders and keep the tractor on one side of the fence and put the bale on the other side of the fence with the front end loader? Okay. Can we put a geotextile, a fabric, and then put gravel on top of it to make a firm foundation? You might actually find there's some funding out there that can help pay for these kinds of solutions to footing and foot disease and erosion that might be happening on farm during the winter. So I certainly include thinking about mud as a winterization type concern.